Hello, everyone. My name is Annie, or Anastasia Straw, as it appears on Blackboard, and I will be presenting on an excerpt from Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. I will begin this video with a brief overview of the text as a whole, then summarize its main points, talk about my reaction, and lastly pose a few questions for you guys to discuss. So without further ado, let's get to it. In this excerpt, John Stuart Mill provides counter-arguments against criticisms as well as misconceptions that people have had against utilitarianism. Now, what exactly is utilitarianism, you may ask? Well, rest assured, J.S. Mill will give you a pretty good sense of what it is and what it is not. So, let's begin with what it is. Utilitarianism is a recognized and intuitive moral theory that believes right actions are those that maximize the amount of good or happiness for the greatest number. This is cleverly known as the greatest happiness principle, which serves as the foundation for utilitarianism. Happiness can mean many different things depending on who you're talking to. However, in this context, it simply means intended pleasure in the absence of pain. Another important thing to note when it comes to utilitarianism is that nothing else matters in deciding whether an action is right or wrong. It only concerns itself with the predicted consequence or consequences. So I'd be like, oh, this is all fine and dandy, but like all theories, utilitarianism has its critics. But despite those critics, John Stuart Mill rises to the occasion and staunchly defends what it is not. Bear with me, there are quite a few. According to Mill, it is not a doctrine worthy only of swine, or Lord forbid, a godless one. Those who think that simply don't fully understand the meaning of utilitarianism. Next, this theory doesn't contain unattainable happiness or require everyone to live happy lives. Maybe we just overinflate the meaning of happiness or misunderstand what the action of a martyr means to utilitarianism. So a few things of what it's not to, I'm just going to list them now. Men are not left cold and unsympathizing. Utilitarianism does not possess too high of standards for the human race and should not wrongly be called expediency. It also does not rob us of time to weigh the consequences for potential happiness when the time comes. In general, I guess Mill responds to many of these objections. I guess I'll just say in a few words. Well, here it is. Utilitarianism is simply misunderstood. So, after reading this article, what did I think? More specifically, what did I find interesting, frustrating, insightful, and/or confusing? Well, to answer this, I thought the reading was pretty straightforward, though I admit there were a few spots where I had to pause and think for a while. But as a whole, there are 2 points that really stuck out to me and made me reconsider how I view this ethical theory. The first was when Mill was talked about the equality of pleasures. More specifically, why we choose higher pleasures over lower ones, despite our temptation to choose those lower ones. So to give a context for this, Mill introduces quality of pleasures to support his belief that our human pleasures are superior to that of animal pleasures. At this point, I was I was pretty unconvinced and believed that morality being all about pleasure was too simple. However, after reading this section on quality, I realized that pleasure is a little more complex than what I had initially thought. Pleasure isn't just about quantity, but also quality. Some pleasures are higher or lower than others. For example, the pleasure I feel from eating Portillo's chocolate cake is definitely not the same type of pleasure I feel from learning a violin concerto. Mill makes sure to point out this difference and include it as part of his utilitarian theory. I guess the last thing that really sold this argument to me was a quote that tries to explain why we choose higher pleasures over the lower ones. Mill says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." So the next point, or second point, that appealed to me was the idea that utilitarianism itself is unattainable because happiness is unattainable. So at first glance, it seems like a very convincing argument against utilitarianism, because I feel as if sometimes I'm surrounded by people that constantly say happiness is unattainable or impossible to have. However, Mill's description of happiness forced me to think about what happiness is. Just because Mill says it's so much better, I think I'm just going to quote him. He says, a state of exalted pleasure lasts only in moments, or in some cases, and with some intermissions, hours or days, and is the occasional brilliant flash of enjoyment, not its permanent and steady flame. Both of these points are what opened me up to the idea of utilitarianism, and helped me to see the appeal of an ethical theory based on consequences. To conclude my video, I shall ask 3 questions for discussion. Number 1, which of Mill's arguments did you find most convincing and least convincing? Explain why. Number 2, if you were to adopt the greatest happiness principle as a basis for morality, what would you struggle most with? Do any of these conflicts align with the criticisms mentioned in the reading? Number 3, according to Mill and other utilitarianism, collective happiness outweighs any individual happiness because all happiness is weighed equally between people. It even calls upon the individual to be a disinterested and benevolent spectator, according to Mill. Do you agree with this, please? Morally speaking, explain your position. I believe that's everything. Thank you for watching. Bye.